Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar, Family Collaboration, an Essential Element for SPED Success, with Dr. Barry Prizant. I'm Glenn McCandless. I'm the executive producer of the SPED Ahead Forum. It's now in its third year. Wow! And this webinar is the second in our three-part fall series called SPED Expectations. It follows a terrific and timely legal update by special education attorney Julie Weatherly. Julie touched on such a critical subject, improving relationships with parents and families. That's a topic that you, our audience, has been clamoring for. And we have over 1,600 special educators from every corner of our country registered for our talk today. So we're so excited to bring you one of the top experts to unpack this for us. You may recognize Barry. He's been a presenter for this forum before with some excellent advice about another hot topic, behavior management strategies. So if you have questions for Barry during the webinar, please enter them into the chat box, and he will answer as many as our time permits following the presentation. We'd also like to invite you to join the conversation about the webinar on Twitter and use the hashtag SPEDAhead. And now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Barry Prizant. Dr. Prizant was recently announced as a recipient of ASH's Honors of the Association. That's the organization's highest accolade. He's an internationally recognized consultant, author, and researcher. In addition, Barry is an expert on autism spectrum disorder and using emotional regulation to prevent problem behavior. He's an adjunct professor at Brown University, and we're so excited about his upcoming new book, Uniquely Human, Seeing Autism Through a Different Lens, which is scheduled to be released this spring by Simon & Schuster. Barry, it's all yours.
I would like to thank Presence Learning for sponsoring this webinar. I'm very excited to be able to present my part on family collaboration, an essential element for special education success, as part of the three-part series. Wonderful presentation by Julie Weatherly talking about some of the legal issues and the legal safeguards that we have to be aware of for families, and also staying out of due process with that knowledge. And the following part 3 will be by Alan Coulter on results-driven accountability. I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about the sources of information for my presentation. First of all, I have 40 years experience as a speech-language pathologist and an educational consultant. And as part of that, we have developed a model for individuals with autism and related disabilities, actually for many children with disabilities, and that is called the CERTS model, in which we really have worked hard to look at the research and the literature on the impact of disability on the family and incorporate that information into our model. Of course, there has been decades of research of the impact of disability on the family, and even though that information is out there, it's not necessarily applied as specifically as we might be able to in working with children and students with disabilities in schools, and that's a large part of what we'll be talking about. I've also been very fortunate to develop and participate in a retreat for parents of children with autism, and we're going into our 20th year of doing this. What this has afforded me is the opportunity to listen to parents speak about their experiences, and so often they do speak about their experiences with school personnel and administrators in schools, in some cases very, very positive experiences, but as you could well imagine, in some cases they discuss the challenges, and we'll be outlining some of the challenges that we hear about. And then finally, I would be remiss not to give credit to Dr. Elaine Meyer, who's the director of the Institute for Professionalism and Ethical Practice at Boston Children's Hospital and the Harvard Medical School. Elaine has done incredible work in the area of difficult conversations in healthcare, and I might also add that she's my wife, and I learn a great deal from her work because I'm constantly surprised about how the challenges that parents face in being supported by and communicating with healthcare professionals, in some cases under very dire circumstances around childhood illness and accidents, how some of those same issues are played out in the public schools in terms of the work that we do in supporting families and trying to communicate effectively with families. So there are a number of issues that we will consider in the presentation today. I'll begin by talking in an introductory manner about why is it important to talk about family collaboration, and I will discuss family-centered practice as an underlying philosophy for all of us. We will then specifically talk about challenges that families face, especially in the early years, but challenges that tend to recur in their efforts to support their kids as they transition from one level of school programming to another level, and then eventually out of school, of course. Many of you who are out there know the great challenges that you often face in supporting families effectively. So we'll talk about practitioner challenges as well, and some of the specific issues that come up, and certainly that I've seen in my consulting over the years. And then finally, we'll talk about the essential elements of family-centered practice. And we're going to outline a wide variety of issues ranging from developing trust with families to the communication style we use, and then how we can build in some principles of family-centered practice in schools in our everyday work with families. So let's begin with why is it important to focus on this topic. Well, many of you who are out there working in the schools, whether you're educators, whether you're related service personnel, whether you're administrators, do understand that we receive very little training for working with and supporting families, especially families under a great deal of stress. Exceptions might include social workers and some psychologists, but many of us, and I include myself as a speech and language pathologist, many of us find that we're flying by the seat of our pants. And I always like to say that being a good person, and in many cases, being very skilled in teaching and providing therapy, does not guarantee our ability to communicate with and support families effectively. And these difficulties are often much more pronounced around stressful circumstances and high-risk times. And we will be discussing some of those times specifically, such as transitions from one school to the next, from one grade to the next, and so forth. We also see every day that the attitudes of parents about professionals in special education vary greatly, and this can be due to the parents' culture, where some parents see us as experts who have to have all the answers and we are here to fix their children's difficulties, to other parents who insist on being equal collaborators from very early on. So when parents come to us, they come to us with very, very different attitudes based upon their culture as well as their past experience. Very often I hear the war stories that parents share with us, and what I'm referring to here is the difficult circumstances they've had, sometimes going back to early diagnosis, and then sometimes, unfortunately, occurring in their first encounters with school professionals. And parents also differ greatly in terms of their understanding of their child's disability. Some parents are very well read, as many of you know. They can cite all the most recent research. They could even challenge some of us on our knowledge on the research. And other parents either are not as well informed or do not wish to be that well informed. I recently did some interviews with some parents who have adult children with autism, and one dad said, and this is a very educated dad and very accomplished in his field, he said, no, I never really read all that much about autism. I wanted to get to know my son as he is as a person, and I found that so much of what I read was not relevant for my son, so don't expect me to be an expert on autism, which was a very interesting experience for me. And then this topic is so important because we need to reflect on the fact that relationships with school staff, how well a school system can support a family, especially a family that lives in one geographic region for a long period of time, that has an incredibly enduring impact on the child and family. It could be very successful in many ways in terms of providing support that the family needs, and at other times it could add stress to the lives of families. But we have to understand that this is such a long-term relationship, so much of an enduring relationship, so much more of an enduring relationship than, for example, a child seeing a speech and language pathologist after school. And this, in essence, results in many of us in school districts joining the family on their journey. And that over many, many years, we could see children grow and change and the progress they've made and the new challenges that families face as well. Finally, this topic of family collaboration is so important because it makes us understand that trust must be earned. But too often, there may be an attitude that because I'm a special educator or an SLP or an OT, that immediately my trust, or your trust in me, should be there, should be solid. However, we understand that trust must be earned. And that has to do with our day-to-day interactions and many other aspects of what goes on in our daily interactions with parents that we'll be discussing in much greater detail a little bit later. What I'd like to do now is share with you a definition of family-centered practice that I included in a publication in 2008. And I want to be clear right up front that when we're talking about family-centered practice, we are talking about a philosophy and approach that underlies all of our interactions with families and children. This is not specific to clinical practice. It is not just in one-to-one work with children. Certainly, family-centered practice has a great impact, or has the potential to have a great impact in many, many different settings, and of course, including school settings. So here's the definition that I'm going to share with you. Family-centered practice has as its primary goal empowering families with the knowledge and skills to make the best choices for their child and for the family. In family-centered practice, professionals collaborate with families in decision-making about specific goals and objectives, as well as educational and treatment approaches. Parents are respected as experts regarding their child, and professionals consider each family's unique strengths and needs, as well as its cultural and religious values. And I would like to highlight a few aspects of this definition, especially in reference to Julie Weatherly's presentation, that when we're talking about helping families to make the best choices for their child and for the family, it doesn't mean that a parent makes all the decisions regarding educational programming. But what is important is that what parents bring to the table needs to be considered, and considered very seriously. And even if a parent brings in an outside professional who maybe had done an outside evaluation, that needs to be considered as well. Too often people misinterpret family-centered practice as parents, family members make all the decisions, and therefore we as professionals just have to follow up on what they wish. But that's not the case. Very often collaboration involves discussion, education, negotiation, if you will. And the legal safeguards in IDEA provides those not only opportunities, but that obligation that we have in providing these kinds of opportunities for families. I'd like to begin my next section in talking about challenges for families. And this is one of the areas that I believe we could be so much more effective with families if we take the time as professionals, as service providers, to think about the experience of a parent, and sometimes really trying hard to think about that experience from very early on, because so often we see children coming to us when they're a bit older, but we don't have that history. We don't know what families had gone through earlier on. So a slide that I love to use because it impacts us in so many ways and impacts families is an understanding of what causes stress for people. And major sources of stress for all human beings include the following. First of all, uncertainty. Second, unexpected events. And third, a lack of control. So let's think about how these sources of stress impact a parent or a family member, and therefore how that impacts us, because in many cases we are the recipient of the emotions that a parent may feel due to these sources of stress. So let's first talk about uncertainty. One of the greatest challenges for families and parents who have children with disabilities is uncertainty about the future. Everything from how independent will my child be, or will my child be successful academically. For students who have difficulties with relationships, such as students on the autism spectrum, will my child have friendships? Will my child be loved by his classmates, be respected by his classmates? And the other issue, more specific to school programming, has to do with uncertainty about how things unfold for my child. Who will my child's teacher be come September or August, depending upon when your school district starts school? Will my child have a focus primarily on academics, or do we have to have much more focus on life skills? So there are so many issues related to an uncertain future for parents, which is a huge issue related to stress. A little bit later, we'll talk about how we can lessen the stress due to uncertainty that parents face, especially around school relationships and school programming. Next is unexpected events. Of course, one of the greatest unexpected events is hearing that your child is not developing typically and that your child will need special supports. So just the fact that a family has a child with special needs is an unexpected event in and of itself. But there are many events in schools that happen to parents that they may not be prepared for, such as their very first IEP meeting. They may be aware that the meeting is happening, but to them it's a culture, if you will, that they've never entered into before, including a language that they've never heard before. And all of this could be extremely stressful. So it's very, very important that parents be prepared for and be given all of the information that they need so things become more expected. They can anticipate what's going to happen and therefore respond appropriately. The last major source of stress, I think that's relevant for our discussion, is a lack of control. Too often, parents, especially parents who have children who pose greater challenges and difficulties, children with regulatory issues, children with behavioral challenges, they're experiencing this lack of control just every day in their lives. And when their child enters a school district where literally they are handing trust over, or they're expected to hand trust over to school personnel, again, that sense of there are things going on in the school setting that I don't have control over. And parents, of course, wish and hope that the professionals are skilled enough and sensitive enough that their child is treated well and is educated and has the opportunity to develop those relationships with other children. As a matter of fact, in my experience, I would say some of the real challenges faced by practitioners is when parents, in a sense, are trying to seize control because there's so much of a lack of control in so many aspects of their life related to their child with special needs. And that could have to do with class placement, could have to do with how many hours of therapy their child gets. And it's a natural drive for parents to want to support their kids in this way. And in a way, it's a strategy to help a parent feel better regulated emotionally if they feel things are more under their control. So I believe if we understand that these elements that cause so much stress for all people are particularly challenging for parents of kids with special needs, then we can help them by reducing uncertainty and by helping them to prepare for potentially unexpected events, and when appropriate, provide some control that they feel empowers them. Let's more specifically go through challenges for families, and that will be the next part of our program. One of the things we can do as service providers and professionals is bend over backwards to try to understand the perspective of a parent or of a family member. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about the challenges for families. And I always believe it's helpful to go back to very, very early on. And what I mean by that is even prior to diagnosis, when parents suspect something is not right and they're searching for answers, this can be an overwhelming time for them. And I've spoken to many, many parents of teenage children with special needs as well as adults with special needs or adult children with special needs, and they remember this period in their lives so clearly. It's a time when they very often feel overwhelmed, they feel lost, and they're trying to understand what is going on. After a parent gets a diagnosis, regardless of what it might be, whether it's ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, whatever the diagnosis might be for the child, just coming to grips and fully understanding what the diagnosis means and the implications for the family and the child's development. And then the understanding for many parents that they're beginning a journey that they never expected they would have in their lives, a journey that might be very different than for a family that's raising children who do not have special needs. Some parents describe this as feeling lost in a storm, and that all the problems that go along with the stress of feeling lost, such as a lack of sleep, such as getting opinions from so many people who want to be helpful, but in many cases the advice they give may not in reality be that helpful. And when we talk about the journey beginning, it doesn't just begin once. And I believe that's something, once again, that helps our understanding of the experience of families. That when a child goes from early intervention, if they're identified younger than 3, and goes into a school program, that's the beginning of the journey. And then the journey continues with the transition from preschool services into elementary services, elementary to middle or junior high school, and so forth. And parents often point out, and research clearly indicates, that parents can experience those same high degrees of stress at every transition. It's not just early on as many of us expect it to be, where a family, quote unquote, accepts the child's diagnosis and disability and is in a very different place. That whole notion of acceptance has been challenged. This particular slide, I think, really captures it for me. This was given to me as a print by a parent of a child with autism, and this mother, her name was Barbara, explains this slide in this manner. When a family initially gets a diagnosis, they understand that they are going out on a long journey, and that ultimately it's going to be their responsibility to design the path, to create the road that they must follow on that journey. However, it's always very difficult to know what the next step is going to be, and there is all of this stress that goes along with the potential for not making the right decision, the quote-unquote right decision. So if there's a misstep, there's the great potential for the parent, who is depicted as this tightrope walker, or the family member to fall into this abyss and not be able to recover. And this translates into what has been referred to as chronic stress for some parents. Now, of course, where does the journey take the parent or take the family? And that's depicted by the sun in the background, the light, the proverbial light, hoping for the best outcome for their child, hoping for the best outcome for their family. Now, in an area that I tend to focus on, and that's autism spectrum disorders, and I believe this is the case, but not to the same extent with other disabilities, while you're on this tightrope as a parent, there are people underneath you screaming at you, go this way, no, do this therapy, engage your child with this special diet because this will be the answer. So in addition to just trying to focus enough to put their child and the family on a path that is helpful, so often there are many, many stressful and disorganizing factors around this process. And in some cases, that occurs from well-meaning people such as relatives within the family. As children get older, and especially for children whose behavior may look different or be more challenging, a major stress for families is explaining their child's behavior to others and dealing with judgmental reactions in public. And what is very interesting is that it appears, and research again has supported this, that the more a child's disability is visible, such as a child who may have Down syndrome or a child who has a physical disability that can be observed, so a child maybe who's not ambulatory and is in a wheelchair, reactions are very, very different than a child who has a disability that appears more hidden, in the sense of the child looks more typical, and in those instances, parents talk about the great deal of stress that they experience with judgmental reactions. Unfortunately, in some cases, whether accurate or not, some parents perceive the reactions of educators and therapists as judgmental as well. And we'll talk about this a little bit later when we talk about communicating with families, because so often we may say things that we feel are helpful but might be perceived as judgmental by the parent, and that certainly interferes with the development of collaborative relationships and trust. Parents get so much advice and so much information from a variety of sources. And in this day and age, that includes, of course, the Internet. The public is so much better informed. So when we see stories on the nightly news about this tremendous new therapy for autism or a new approach for children with Down syndrome, people in our lives might hear that and they want to give us that good advice that they feel would be helpful for us as a parent. So who are we to believe if we're a parent or a family member in the face of so many opinions, in some cases discrepant opinions, and so much discrepant information? This could impact even diagnosis, where it's not uncommon for people to make judgments about whether a child is on the autism spectrum or not, and hearing a great deal of differing opinions about that. And certainly when we talk about treatment, this is an area where there are so many different approaches and so many different opinions. So again, this poses a great challenge for parents or family members because they're trying to find the right thing to do, and at the same time they need to juggle all of this information that's coming to them. And for those parents who really feel motivated, as any parent would be, to get all the information they can, that could be a disruptive factor in the life of the family as well. I remember clearly in one of our parent retreats, one mother shared in one of our circle discussions about how she was staying up till 3 or 4 in the morning every night on the Internet looking for any new treatment that could help her child. And it was making her totally exhausted. It was interfering with the marriage, and just the routine of the family. And as part of our discussion in the retreat, she said, I need to understand that I need to take care of myself. But that natural drive, that protective and that drive to heal your child is so powerful. We have to help families in some cases understand the pros and the cons of that. So we did speak about which treatments to choose or approaches to take, and this impacts school personnel as well, because very often school parents will come to school personnel, will come to an IEP meeting saying, I want this particular therapy for my child. Can you hire an outside consultant to come out and teach your staff how to do this? And of course, this must be considered, as Julie indicated clearly in her webinar, that we just can't reject it outright, and even if we don't fully agree with the particular approach. And here's where collaboration and trust is so important. And then dealing with the future, as we noted. Transitions in particular. What's going to happen next? Who's going to be working with my child? And changes that might happen. I've been involved in a number of consulting opportunities where a new special education director came in midstream, sometimes mid-year, and of course that raised major questions for parents as well as for staff. And sometimes these challenges are shared by families as well as school staff. And I've been involved in a number of situations where a new administrator had to work to develop trust with the staff, and of course families are very, very aware of these kinds of changes. There are a lot of folks out there, and this is an old slide of me, if you will, who hang out their shingles and will encourage parents to use their services, and in many cases these professionals are not necessarily very well versed in a particular area of disability. To use a term that I'm hesitating to use, but it is accurate in some cases, there are many charlatans out there who truly are not credentialed professionals, but we see so much potential income coming to some folks out of, if you will, the area of providing services for children with disabilities. And we have to be, in schools, the people who are informed, a stable source of support for parents. If we are not, then parents are much, much more likely to be at risk for having to deal with folks who may not have the best intentions. That's depicted very nicely. Professor Marvel never guesses, he knows. I always like to say that if a professional comes across as being absolutely certain, especially in areas that are still very controversial, such as treatments for autism spectrum disorders, special diets, children with sensory issues, that we should be suspicious of that unless the person really can cite the sources of information, research that guides their practice, and so forth. And once again, in my particular area of focus, autism spectrum disorders, probably more so than any other area of disability, there are many named approaches and interventions, and I include some of our work in that, the CERTS model, which tends to be a very flexible and individualized approach, as well as other approaches that have evidence to support their effectiveness. And parents are faced with that challenge. And we discussed already the problems with uncertainty, transitions, and change. So let's talk about transitions a little bit more specifically. That poses a great challenge to family members and parents. First of all, who will be working with my child? Parents want to know, what is this person's experience? What additional training have they gotten, even since graduating? One thing that parents ask many times is, does this person enjoy working with my child? And what parents wish for is, does this person love my child? Because then they can at least put some trust into the fact that the person's intentions have so much to do with the welfare of the child and not some kind of predetermined notion of what needs to be done with the child as a, if you will, a disability category. I've had many parents say to me, I don't want a person to walk in and have this script on how to work with my child with ADHD or have this script on how to work with my child with autism. I want them to be able to see my child as an individual and understand my child for who he or she is as a person. Transitions, of course, also pose a great challenge to children directly. So how will my child react to a new classroom, a new environment, different kinds of activities, especially children with sensory issues? How will my child react to an environment that may appear challenging and overwhelming on a sensory level? Probably one of the biggest issues has to do with letting go, if you will, of previous trusting relationships. When a child, for example, moves from one level of school to another level of school, and it's ramped up that much more. When a child goes from one school to a totally different school, but even within a school setting such as an elementary school, going from second to third grade or third to fourth grade, parents often express the fact that when they've had an absolute wonderful teacher or wonderful team and the child is going to be shifted to another team, there's a great deal of stress around letting go of that level of comfort and then shifting trust to new staff. Another major stress for parents is as children get older, they are no longer seen in the same light that they might have been seen when they were younger. And so parents often talk about the fact that, oh, when my child did that when he was 4 or 5, it was cute. But now that he's 9 or 10 and rocks persistently when he's stressed, or shows a little bit of boldness in rejecting an activity, now it's seen as a problem. So there are new expectations for children as they develop, as they get older. And when a child is no longer seen as developmentally younger, very often staff, understandably, will have very, very different expectations for that child. The child's ability to attend, the child's ability to follow directions, and to be in the flow of school activities. Whereas it's expected almost for all preschoolers that we will have to put a little bit more effort into helping them regulate emotionally and be involved in activities. Transitions also often require a future perspective. And what we're referring to here is looking beyond the next month of the school year, or even looking beyond the rest of this school year. So now we need to consider what's going to be happening in a few years. I had an experience a number of years ago, and this was around a student with autism, where the child was entering the last years of elementary school, and he was going to transition to middle school for 6th grade. And what happened in this instance, and this was a student who was quite challenged in terms of his abilities. In addition to his autism, he had significant food sensitivities and sensory sensitivities. And his mother pleaded with the school staff, can we hold him back one additional year in elementary school? We don't feel he's ready to deal with the complexity of middle school. And I remember so clearly that she began to talk about this in October of his 5th grade year. In other words, 10 months before the transition was to occur, she said she was losing sleep over that transition. The staff really listened carefully to her, and even though school policy was such that all children were expected to proceed and transition, they made an exception for this student, which was a very, very wise decision. But this is an example of when parents need to think about the future, as they do need, and as all parents do, that can cause tremendous anxiety when we talk about those bigger transitions that happen. Outside of the school setting, families face many, many challenges, such as finding balance. How much attention do I give to my child? How healthy is our marriage? Of course, for single parents, things are thrown out of kilter in terms of balance because there's so much more obligation placed on a parent to keep things at even keel and keeping the family healthy and moving along. How much attention do we give to siblings, and how do we help our siblings understand the member of the family who has a disability? And, of course, obligations having to do with employment for both parents or individual parents as well. So these are issues that certainly indirectly impact school personnel because there could be so much going on in the life of the family outside of the school setting, which affects parents' mood, degree of stress they experience, and so forth. One parent explained this to me in the following manner: I often feel like I'm juggling a million balls at the same time. And of course the fear here is that I'm going to drop some of those balls and ultimately it will have the negative impact on my child. This is a famous painting, of course, known as The Scream, Edvard Munch, and I think it's a wonderful depiction of that notion of struggling to juggle a million balls at the same time. Okay, that concludes this part of our program in terms of challenges on families, and we will shift and take a look at challenges for practitioners. We've just considered challenges faced by families, and now let's talk about challenges for practitioners around family collaboration and developing trusting, collaborative relationships. One of the challenges that practitioners face, and I see this all the time in my consulting, is the amount of time and energy in working directly with children in contrast to supporting the parents' knowledge and competence in supporting their children. So I hear so often in school districts that both educators as well as related service personnel wish to have more time to work with parents because they understand and they believe that if they can support families well and parents well, then their children will receive the benefit of that in so many different settings outside of school. Unfortunately, schools were not developed to be family-centered. And what I mean by that is schools were developed to provide appropriate services and to educate children. Yet there are things that we could do that I'll discuss a little bit later where we could, if you will, think out of the box and provide additional supports that helps parents in terms of their abilities to support their children. Of course, this is more easily done with younger children and is actually the very core of early intervention services for many children before they enter school districts. But we need to think about not only the potential impact on children, but also the relationship and the collaboration that comes out of these efforts. Another great challenge for practitioners is listening to and respecting parental priorities about different treatment options or about priorities for the child's IEP while trying to provide services based on effective practices. So in many areas of childhood disability, as I noted, there are so many treatments that are proposed almost on a monthly basis, sometimes without evidence in supporting their effectiveness. And parents with all good intentions may bring those treatment options to the school team, and the school team may feel, well, we don't see the evidence for this yet, or we would love to do this, but we just don't have the capacity to do this right now. So it's a very, very important issue in terms of the development of the relationship because parents may feel that they're not being heard. This does provide an opportunity for good discussions about what parents read about and what they hear about. And we like to think of this as an opportunity for educational support to families. Of course, very often when there already is a trusting relationship that's established, parents will listen carefully to the feedback that we give them. But this still remains a challenge for practitioners. And once again, I'd like to reiterate what Julie said in the first part of this three-part webinar, and that is we need to consider what parents bring to the table. A major source of mistrust that I often see is when we reject openly what parents bring to the table, and then parents feel they're not being heard. So often, parents who, especially parents who have the resources, will go for outside evaluations, and those outside evaluations may come with recommendations from professionals who may have discrepant opinions about philosophy or approach for treatment. In some cases, recommendations may be seen as what is being dictated to the staff in the school district, and once again, from the parents' perspective, they think and they're acting on what they believe is the best for their child. And when they bring recommendations to the school staff and to the school team, it may cause an area of disagreement and an area of stress. So this also remains a great challenge for practitioners. How can we listen with respect to what parents bring to the table and have a discussion that's helpful and educational for all involved, rather than parents believing or thinking they hear that their ideas are being rejected? In so many cases, parents wish to discuss what is stressful for them about having a child with special needs. Sometimes it's related specifically to the child. Sometimes it's related to areas that we may not be qualified to address, such as marital problems. But too often, because of why we go into special education, as educators and therapists, we have this compulsion to want to fix and we want to rescue. In many cases, what parents want to hear is that you're listening to me and you understand how difficult it is sometimes. Another way of saying this is learning how to bear witness. I often like to discuss the difference between providing educational support versus emotional support. And this is not so easy to decipher in some cases when we listen to parents. Are they truly looking for suggestions that may be helpful for their child. For example, when they talk about their child's sleeping difficulties, very, very common in children with neurologically based developmental disabilities. Or are they just sharing how sleep-deprived they feel and how challenging it is, and they just want somebody to be able to acknowledge, I get it, I understand how difficult it is for you. Making that distinction is very, very important, and certainly learning to listen, as we'll be discussing in greater depth in a few moments, is a very, very important strategy for professionals that helps to build collaborative and trusting relationships. Another challenge for school staff is putting so much energy into developing these relationships, and even though a school year may seem like a long period of time in some cases, it's a relatively short period of time, and then letting go. And this is an emotional issue for many professionals. I often speak to professionals in early intervention who say that what is so difficult for them is that they work with children and families at this very crucial, fragile time for the child and the family in the early years, and then, depending upon what state you live in, at 3 or 5 years of age, the child and the family moves on. And they feel that, my goodness, I do not get to see what happens. I put so much energy into supporting the child and family in the early years and hopefully provide the foundation for future progress. But as a professional, I'm not able to see the fruits of my labor in working with this parent or working with this family. But this occurs within the school years as well. Fortunately, in some cases, and I see this quite a bit in my consulting, professionals who work with the child in the earlier years still get to see the child as they move on through the grades until they possibly move to a different school setting. But we have to at least acknowledge this notion of developing a strong bond with a child, and then the child moves on. That is a challenge for many practitioners. In addition to these challenges, Julie had discussed some of the challenges around procedural violations and some of the legal safeguards that we have to have in place for families. And now we will talk about what are some of the essential elements for developing positive relationships and successful collaboration with families. Now that we've discussed challenges faced both by practitioners as well as by families, let's really dig in now and talk about essential elements for successful collaboration. And first I'm going to review a number of these elements, and then we will discuss in much more specific terms strategies that we can use to really make sure that we have these elements in place. First of all, building trust. Secondly, creating opportunities for collaborating. So often we just look at progress report meetings or IEPs as the context for collaboration, but we can create so many more opportunities than that. Third, communicating clearly and listening well. And I will really be emphasizing the importance of a non-judgmental attitude. We live in a very judgmental culture, and we need to understand that parents of kids with disabilities are particularly sensitive to these, in some cases, inadvertent looks or words that may appear judgmental to them. We'll be talking about demonstrating loyalty, and what I mean by that is that as professionals, as service providers, our primary loyalty is to providing services for the child. Too often, I see circumstances where parents feel that professionals are not being transparent, that professionals are being very guarded in what they say because their loyalty is to the school district as opposed to the child and the family. And then finally, being humble and realizing what role we play in the life of a child and a family. And I'd actually like to begin on that point with a quick story. You see a slide here of a merry-go-round. Many, many years ago, a dad who came to speak to one of my university classes on autism shared the following story. He said that having a child with a disability and raising any children, in fact, is like living on a merry-go-round. And it feels that way because there are so many people who get on and off the merry-go-round as life proceeds. And what he shared was that my family lives on that merry-go-round, and you, as an educator or a speech and language pathologist, may get on for a few rotations, but then you get off. But we live on this merry-go-round. And he was talking about his son with autism at this time, who was about 15 years of age, and he shared that he and his wife calculated that his son had, quote unquote, trained about 172 professionals in the life of the family and in the life of raising this child. As a matter of fact, I got a phone call from him last year, and his son is now 44 years old, and he is in his 70s, and continued talking about people who've been helpful and people who are not so helpful in the life of their son and the family. And right away I thought about that merry-go-round analogy that he shared. So being humble has to do with, first of all, understanding where the family comes from and the challenges that they've had before, as well as understanding that after this school year, this family and this child will go on and meet other people who will potentially be helpful in their lives. So that perspective I find to be a very, very important perspective. A strategy that I often like to share is that when we start working with a family, we might say to them, do you wish to talk a little bit about your child's life and your experience with previous services? What happened around early diagnosis? And I often add to this request, only if you feel comfortable in doing so. I find many parents really appreciate hearing that a professional is interested in everything that happened that kind of, if you will, shaped their perspective about raising their son or daughter, that led them to believe certain things about professionals based upon the very positive experiences that they've had, and in some cases, the very negative experiences. What parents do not like, in my experience, is when professionals come in feeling like they are the most important person for the family or in the life of the child at that moment, without having that longitudinal perspective. So successful family support begins with trust, and trust is built upon, in part, the interpersonal characteristics of program staff. And as we said, it takes years to build trust and a few seconds to destroy it, and that's unfortunate. Where I see good relationships sometimes go down the tubes very, very quickly when, for example, a parent hears that a teacher had said something about the child or about them that maybe wasn't terribly flattering. I'm going to share with you some information that originally was inspired by the work of Stephen Covey in his book, The SPED of Trust, and this is a book about developing trust in business relationships. But when I read this book, I found it was just so relevant. So I've taken some of this information and adapted it for working with parents and families of children with special needs. We'll begin first with indicators of character, things that let the parent know that we have integrity and that we are professionals who can work effectively with them and their child. First of all, talking straight. Sometimes it's difficult for us to understand that we've developed a highly specialized vocabulary in talking about children with special needs. And an example that comes up over and over again is when we talk about children who have developmental delays. So often we refer to the child's difficulty as delays, which for many parents is translated into, oh, well, he'll catch up, everything will be just fine. When the reality might be your child has a significant neurodevelopmental disability that is going to require special services and attention for many years. So too often we just use the jargon that we use every day with our colleagues when speaking with parents. And it's so important to make sure that we are talking using terminology that parents can easily interpret. And this also goes for written reports as well. As a matter of fact, one of my practices in the past, after I did an evaluation, and this was in a private practice for a child, was to make sure that we had a time set up where I could go over the report and make sure the parents could ask questions about any phrasing or any terminology that they did not understand. Another character indicator is demonstrating respect. And this plays out in many ways. Let me give you a specific example. One father once shared with me that he really resented it when he came to meetings at school, and a professional, well-meaning, would refer to him as dad and would refer to his wife as mom. So during the meeting would be, well, Mom, what do you think about that? Well, Dad, what do you think about that? I often suggest that we ask parents how they wish to be called. Do you wish to be called Mr. Jones? Do you wish to be called Tom? What are you comfortable with? That's one way to demonstrate respect. because right away, not only does it give the parent a choice, but it doesn't pigeonhole them into a certain kind of hierarchy. Well, you're just a mom or you're just a dad. I've had parents say to me, for example, well, you know, Barry, this is what I think, but I'm just a mom. And I like to say, no, you are, at the very least, mom in capital letters, but more accurately, you are Mrs. Smith, mother of Tommy. So I think it's very, very important that we really look at the language that we use. I actually published an article about this a few years ago where I challenged commonly used terms such as the child has non-compliant behavior, which assumes that the child is always choosing to behave in a certain way, and that is not to comply. The language that we use can be one of the foundations or one of the barriers to demonstrating respect. Creating transparency. Again, this has to do with talking straight, but once again, communicating in a way that we're saying directly what we mean. And what we need to do is to ask parents, in many cases, am I being clear? Do you want me to say this in a different way? To make sure that that communication is happening rather than just assuming that it's happening. Now, of course, one of the interpersonal skills that is related to this is reading the parents' reactions and expressions. So rather than coming in with an agenda or a script, we need to be able to react in real time and adjust what we're saying, requesting whether there's a need for clarification at those points in time. One of my favorite character indicators in terms of building trust is righting wrongs. Too often, we will say something that might be off-putting to a parent, and we realize it, but we don't correct it. Sometimes we'll share information with a parent, factual information that's inaccurate, maybe about a disability, maybe about a meeting time, and we don't come back and apologize for that. One thing that I found is when we right wrongs in a public setting, such as a meeting, it's even that much more powerful than righting the wrong in a one-to-one interaction. So an example of that might be if we're meeting with a parent and there are other team members there saying that, you know, Mrs. Holman, last time I said something to you and I really apologize for the way I said that, and I would just like you to know that. Or last time I shared some information with you that I thought was correct, but that was inaccurate. And when we do it in a public setting, that helps to build trust because in a way we're putting it right on the line that we want to be clear with you and we want to be honest with you. Showing loyalty. This is a very challenging situation for many practitioners in schools because so often what happens is teachers and related service providers are between a rock and a hard place. And in some cases are being told by administrators that you really need to stick up for the school district or you really need to stand your ground on this particular point. What I mean by showing loyalty is always focusing on our legal obligation to provide a free and appropriate education for this student, and that what we need to do is make sure that all of our efforts and the discussion is focused on that to the extent possible. Now, I know this sounds very idealistic and pie in the sky, but one of the great turnoffs for parents that I see in meetings so often is when professionals come across as if, well, their loyalty is to their school district and not so much to their child or to an administrator or to another staff member in the program. But the child really needs to be front and center. There are related interpersonal characteristics that help to support trust that have to do with professional competence, and I'm going to review those briefly right now. Of course, delivering results is so important. When parents see that the child is making progress, and that progress could be objectively defined and shared, that is a huge step in terms of developing those trusting collaborative relationships. And in the third part of this webinar series, Alan Coulter will be talking about the shift to results-driven accountability, which is totally consistent with the importance of delivering results. Growing professionally, getting better as a professional. Now, this is a challenging area, which I did not mention earlier, for professionals, especially with school budgets being so limited and budget freezes in many cases that do not allow for school personnel to be able to go to continuing education activities, such as this one. But it's very, very important for parents to hear that professionals are seeking new information, are looking into new research, and ideally have the opportunity to go to continuing education activities throughout the school year on a regular basis. That doesn't necessarily mean going out to conferences and workshops. It could also mean within the context of the school, such as journal reading groups, such as case presentations, and so forth. I see this being done in many school districts, especially with budgets being limited for external opportunities for continuing education. One of the real challenges for professionals is to have this balance of being realistic, confronting reality in terms of a child's developmental challenges, but keeping hope alive for progress and growth. Parents want us to be clear and transparent, as I mentioned. Parents want us to be able to share with them some of the challenges we see in the school setting that they most likely have seen in other settings as well. But at the same time, always talking about the next steps, always talking about the strategies that we are attempting to deal with. For example, this child's outbursts in class, or this child's tendency to bolt out of the classroom, or other difficulties that are related to problem behaviors in kids, a topic that I discussed in a previous webinar for Presence Learning. So how can we do that? Well, it's a matter of sharing and coming to consensus with parents, talking about what we see, confronting the reality of what we see, but still talking about the next steps and the potential for growth and change. And then clarifying expectations in terms of the progress that we hope to see in the future. And one of the great challenges that families face is when they feel that they're not seeing enough progress, but it might be they don't have enough information or knowledge to talk about the small steps that their child is showing and improving. So, for example, if a parent is only focused on a child being able to speak, let's say a non-speaking child, do we talk about the broader issue of social communication, that a child is initiating more even through gestures? Do we talk about what are the small steps that lead to speech, such as a child now beginning to use a pointing gesture to communicate? Do we talk about expectations for classroom behavior in terms of a child's ability to stay focused and stay fully engaged in learning in a classroom? I think we need to talk in much greater and much more specific terms with parents about what our expectations are, both with the student as well as what we would hope the parents could follow through on and what the parents can do. Now, in these particular situations, we also have to make sure that our expectations of parental engagement are realistic, because one of the great barriers to developing a trusting relationship is if we have very high expectations for parents in terms of their involvement with their child, but due to the family circumstances or due to limited knowledge on the part of the parents, they cannot fulfill those expectations. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the everyday interpersonal back and forth reciprocal conversations that we have with parents. Here's a quote from Larry King that I feel is so informative. He was asked by a person interviewing him, why is it that when you interviewed so many famous celebrities over the years, you talked very little? You would ask a question and you would just listen. It's so unlike most people who do interviews who make the interview more about themselves than about the person they're interviewing. And his response was very simple. I never learned anything when I was talking. And I do believe that for many professionals, sometimes talking a great deal is their comfort level. Because if we could control conversations, that gives us a sense of I'm informing, I'm providing valuable information, and too often we put parents in the position of just nodding their heads. When I go to progress report meetings or planning meetings or IEP meetings, and I see parents having the opportunity to talk a great deal with professionals really putting a lot of energy into listening, it just feels so right. And in so many cases, it validates the respect that the team has for parents. Now, understanding that supports can come in many, many different ways, and that when we are in a position to provide support, we must do so, and that all of us require support in our lives. And a quote from Maya Angelou, in order to survive, a human being needs to live in a home furnished with hope. Once again, getting back to that sensitive balance in our discussions with parents about always looking ahead, always looking towards the hopeful potential for growth and change in their child, and even during difficult times, putting it in the context of a child's development. That can be so helpful in terms of the way we interact and talk with parents. When parents get information that is perceived as not helpful or possibly as pessimistic about the potential for change in their child, right away that can interfere with the development of trust. Here's another quote from a father of an 8-year-old boy. "The people who have been most helpful to us are those who do not take away our hope. We have learned to keep away from the doom and gloom crowd." And he was actually talking about listening to other parents in support group meetings. So even though we are talking about the importance of being supportive with parents in our interactions, in many cases that does not really happen. And around children and students who have more extreme behavioral difficulties, who will have a great deal of problematic behavior just due to the nature of their disability, we always have to make sure the conversation is solution-oriented and in terms of the next steps. One other quote that I heard from a parent is that, so often we hear about the problems all the time. We would like to hear about the small indications of positive change that you're seeing. Even if you have to stretch a little bit to do that, that gives us hope for the future. Just to kind of sum up what parents find helpful, first of all, honest and accurate information, but beyond that, resources that may be helpful for them, and resources that can take many, many forms. First of all, many school districts provide lending libraries or DVD libraries that will be helpful for parents so they can get information. Parents so often say, we don't want sugarcoating when you're talking about our child. Be honest, be accurate, and then give us resources that could help us. Of course, it goes without saying that parents want quality services for their child, and in many cases, support for the family. And I want to be a little bit more clear on this notion of support. It doesn't mean that in the school district that the school staff are obligated or even capable of providing all forms of support. There may be supports in the community that could be helpful, a referral to mental health agencies, for example. Marital counseling can be very, very helpful to a family. But to come up with no potential solutions is extremely stressful for a parent, especially at those highest degrees of stress where there's something going on in the life of the family that is difficult. And here's where we could say, I don't have some information that would be helpful now, but let me look it up and I'll get back to you with that information. That's a little bit about going the extra mile, and parents really not only appreciate that, but again, that develops that sense of collaboration. We're working on this together. This also, of course, leads to strong partnerships with professionals. I always like to recommend whenever possible that professionals in a school district participate in activities outside of school that may involve the child and family. So whether it's a walk for a particular category of disabilities, an autism walk, whether it has to do with going to see a child's baseball game when they have that student in their class, that really communicates to parents that we are more than just working with your child. We really want to develop that positive relationship. Parents often report that a good night of sleep is helpful for them. And, of course, school staff have very little to do with that other than making referrals to professionals who can help, such as sleep clinics. But these are things that parents tell us at our parent retreat every year, and that they have as high priority in terms of what's helpful for them. Learning tips, suggestions from other parents. I consult with some school districts where the district makes opportunities or creates opportunities for parents to talk with other parents. And in many cases, this is not necessarily a support group run by professionals. It might be informal discussion groups or just making a room available in the school for parents to get together for a coffee hour. So when parents can communicate with other parents, this is very, very important and really builds trust. In these kinds of meetings, we see social support happening and experience sharing with others. So just creating this opportunity helps professionals in schools be seen as going the extra mile. And then finally, respite opportunities. What I'd like to point out here is it's not always possible to provide some of these supports, but I do consult the school districts where they have a parents' night out, for example, where school staff may volunteer for 2 to 3 hours after school one day a month to allow parents to go shopping, to allow parents to go out for dinner. And again, if you want to develop loyalty with parents very quickly, if we create opportunities for them to normalize the life, especially for children with more severe disabilities and more challenging behaviors, where it may be difficult for parents to bring them out into the community, this is seen as extremely helpful. Alrighty. In terms of conversations on a more specific level, I would like to reiterate some points that are very, very important to consider. Once again, make sure that we are a good listener and that we give parents the time in a non-judgmental way to share what they wish to share. Of course, built into procedural safeguards in the IEP process is about asking parents about their priorities and, in some cases, if it's not specifically an IEP meeting, what they would like to accomplish or cover in a meeting. That may be a progress report meeting or maybe a meeting that a parent is requesting. Let me tell you a very quick story about what happens when a parent's priorities are not asked about and what that can create. A number of years ago, I was consulting to a child who was transitioning out of early intervention into a preschool setting. And in this meeting, the professionals had done something that Julie Weatherly said should not be done, and that is they came in with a predetermined IEP. And number one on their IEP, top priority, was to make sure that this little boy was toilet trained. The mother, who happened to be a pediatrician, when she was presented with that, said, "That is not my priority. My highest priority is my child's communication skills. And we will work on the toilet training, but I do not want that to be the highest priority in school that everybody is working on." The mother became quite irate because she felt control was being taken away from her. And of course, in Julie's first part of the webinar, she made a very important point about not coming in and with predetermined goals, objectives, or a predetermined IEP, because that is actually against the law. In conversing with parents, we really try to understand their perspective, their level of understanding, and as well as emotionally what they're feeling about the issue that we're discussing. Too often, we try to be the bearer of facts and the bearer of information, and we don't respond on that emotional support level. Even acknowledging that the particular topic we're talking about is very difficult for the parent when we see the parent become a little bit overwhelmed emotionally. Giving parents the time to maybe come back again and we'll discuss this issue. Very, very important to consider the parent's perspective. A few years ago, I was in a circumstance in the school where it was very clear that a particular mom had a great deal of sensitivity about where her child's program was going. And this was a young man with autism who was transitioning to middle school. And she had a lot emotionally invested in his academic success. When the meeting was being planned, it was clear that many of the staff felt that for this young man, there needed to be more functional life skill goals oriented into his program. And everybody was aware that this particular mom would not take that information lightly. She would feel that, okay, we're giving up on academics for this young man. I had mentioned to the special education director that due to this sensitivity and the feelings of the staff, would it be possible for her to meet on a one-to-one basis before the IEP meeting just to have some back-and-forth conversation about some of the recommended goals and objectives as this young man moves on in school, just so that she could ask questions and understand that with some of the shifts that they may recommend to life skills, that they're not giving up on academics, that will be included as well. Well, unfortunately, this special ed director chose not to do this, and she said, "Don't worry, the meeting will go fine." And then as we went into the meeting, and initially as each of the staff members presented this young man's progress and their recommendations for the future, it became clear to me and to everybody else that this was emotionally overwhelming for this mom. And then eventually, after the second or third professional discussed their results and their recommendations, which clearly were oriented more towards life skills, she began to cry and ran out of the room. In this situation, that could have been avoided with greater understanding of the parent's perspective and her level of understanding that incorporating more recommended life skills goals did not mean giving up on academics. Another way that we could be very successful with parents is collaborating on assessment and validating their expertise. Asking them, this is really important for us to understand what you know about your child, how you see your child succeed in some instances, have difficulty in other situations. But basically, you are the expert on your child. We're not saying you're the expert on your child's diagnosis, or you're not necessarily the expert on academics for your child, but you see your child in so many different settings, and we need to have that information so that what we work on is meaningful and purposeful relative to what's important for you as a parent. Huge area is focusing on a child's strengths, in addition to the area of needs as well, and not just focusing on what they're good at, but incorporating what they're motivated to do and what they're good at in the school setting. Parents often get to see that outside of school, what their child loves to do, what really engages their child, what motivates their child. And one of the ways in conversations with parents that we can develop that trust is being interested in that and acknowledging that, and then in thinking creatively about how we can use that in learning academics, in supporting a child's attention, in supporting relationships with peers. Being a trustworthy partner has to do with following through with what we say we'll do and getting back to parents when we say we'll be getting back to them. That goes for being a trustworthy partner with any person in life, but we should not take that lightly when it comes to our obligation in being trustworthy with parents. And we spoke about the importance of reducing uncertainty, talking about upcoming activities, upcoming meetings, and just laying out what we'll be recommending so that parents are very knowledgeable about that. I want to share a circumstance that happened a few years back where I was consulting to a school district, and I was asked to meet with a number of parents. This was an open meeting in the evening, and when I met with a number of the parents in the school district, and I was introduced as the new consultant for the students with autism and related disabilities, the administrators, the two administrators who introduced me, then left, and they said as they left the room, "We want you to have an opportunity to speak candidly with Barry, so we're going to leave." And they walked out of the room in the school, and I was not prepared for what I heard. Many of the parents just railed against the school, feeling that, the school hides all this information from them. And they were saying, we have no idea about transition planning for our child. We have no idea, and this was, as I recall, this was in April of the school year. We hear nothing about what's being planned for our child's program. They're not doing anything. They just want to dictate everything to us. When I shared some of that information later with the administrators, they said, "We're shocked. We've been having planning meetings since January for transitioning some of these students." What they didn't do was inform the parents of that. They had nothing in writing, and they didn't share that information verbally, that we really work hard on transition planning halfway through the school year, the year before the transition happens. And the parents just assumed that either it wasn't happening or all this information was being hidden from them. So I always recommend, and in many cases I recommend that this be put in print, that parents are aware of upcoming activities, transition points, what is the role of the staff, what meetings will be upcoming. So important and so essential. On a related note, I have a son, typically developing son, who's a senior in high school right now, and I'm amazed at the planning that has gone into all the requirements for applying to college and the information that's given to parents. And it makes myself and my wife so comfortable as parents because we feel that in his particular school, he's in good hands for the transition to college. And so much of it has to do with reducing uncertainty. That, for us, it's the first time we're putting a child through college, and we don't know what the process is. And so much of that was just laid out for us actually at the end of the junior year, and we feel so grateful for that. And I could only imagine how much less anxiety there would be amongst parents of kids with special needs if we bothered to do that and put that energy up front. And then finally, engaging in transition planning in a collaborative and comprehensive way, not just saying we're going to do it, but because transitions are such a great challenge, making sure that we put those plans in place. So these are some of the issues around strategies that we could use in supporting families and some of the essential elements for collaboration. Okay, that concludes our discussion of providing support for families and ways that we could communicate effectively with families to develop positive collaborative relationships.
Well, Barry, that was absolutely fantastic. We are so grateful for having you here with us today. And judging from the number of questions that have come in from our audience, there's a tremendous amount of interest in this topic and what you've had to say. So I'm ready to toss you some questions from the audience, Barry. We have a lot of them here. Are you ready?
I am ready.
All right, so let's get started here. How do you manage appropriate family collaboration, in light of large caseloads and short school days? I mean, time limitations, as you know, Barry, are one of the biggest concerns for our audience.
Yes, and this certainly is an issue that comes up all the time in my consulting. And I think we need to think about the times we need to directly interact with families as opposed to providing information to families that would be very helpful for them. So point number one is that family collaboration does not necessarily mean it has to be sit-down, face-to-face, special times designated for that. One of the things that we just discussed was that for information that relates to standard procedures, such as transition planning and so forth, we can develop print materials and brochures to share with all the parents. Because so often when parents do wish to have special time with us or talk to us about that, it may be around information that's relevant for many, many families. Having planning meetings where we meet with groups of parents together to provide some of that boilerplate information can be very helpful. Other ways have to do with strategies that are often used by practitioners, educators, and therapists. And that could be, for example, having a daily notebook or email correspondence and to share information. Again, it doesn't require face-to-face information, but it does involve an element of collaboration and doesn't demand the amount of time that might be demanded in face-to-face meetings. Related to that is the issue of, what are the best ways to collaborate, the best way to approach communications with parents. And I find in my consulting that one of the issues around this has to do with the level of urgency when parents want to speak about issues with us. So it may be helpful, for example, in collaborating with parents, and especially around issues that come up rather suddenly, to have a system, if you will, of urgency. So sometimes I speak in my consulting with staff about setting up a system of urgent issues that need to be collaborated on versus moderate issues, for lack of a better term, that need to be collaborated on versus issues of lower concern. So an example of an urgent issue might be if a child is demonstrating more extreme problem behaviors outside of the school environment, or there are issues that come up around nutrition, which are very high priority issues for parents. In those cases, then we could maybe prioritize collaborative meetings with parents where we try to schedule those as quickly as possible. Moderate issues might be issues of concern that are not immediate or urgent, and immediate communication is not required, where we could set maybe more of a distant timeline to talk about that. And then issues of lower concern might be related to issues related to future decisions down the line, planning for next year, suggestions for supports. For example, if a child is using various visual supports, such as schedules, we want to make them more sophisticated, addressing changes in a child's program. Those are some things that could be scheduled in the future if it's not an immediate concern. So I feel that some of the issues around appropriate family collaboration, given the time limitations that staff have,
is to really try to prioritize what are the immediate issues where parents really feel they need some feedback or they need some support, as opposed to the more distant issues. And literally asking parents about that and saying sometimes we just have to be honest, especially around times of the year that things get a little bit crazier, especially, let's say, in secondary school where there might be testing periods or there might be periods where staff have a lot more obligations, that we need to let parents know that, but at the same time, we need to reduce uncertainty by letting them know when we can get together collaboratively, when we can work with them. Another suggestion also, and I think this is more available for younger kids, for preschoolers, kids in the early elementary years, are to use other materials rather than giving advice directly for parents around collaboration. So a concrete example might be some of the materials developed by the Hannon Center in Toronto for kids with language communication disabilities, and they have special programs for kids with autism. And what they do is they develop materials that are family, parent-friendly, that can be shared with parents that are at a very basic reading level. So even parents maybe who have some difficulty with reading ability, these types of supports are geared towards parents of a wide range of abilities. And some parents find that very, very helpful. So rather than sitting down collaboratively and spending a lot of one-to-one time, we certainly might want to meet with parents, but also give them some of these commercially available resources that can reinforce what we say and help them carry on without us in some cases.
Well, I tell you, Barry, considering the time constraints that our audience deals with, those are some fantastic suggestions. I know everyone really appreciates that. And, you know, during your presentation, Barry, more than once you referenced transition issues in a lot of different ways. And one of our questions relates to that. One of our listeners sent in this question saying, our early intervention program, which is ages 0 to 3, I don't know what about 0, but maybe shortly after 0 anyway, works on functional developmental outcomes with families in natural environments. What processes between early intervention program and the school district have been successful to continue parent involvement and to build on the strategies that were previously presented by the early interventionists?
This is such a crucial issue, and I feel it's one of the times that school personnel can really put a lot of the eggs in the basket of developing trust. If you think about families whose kids are coming out of early intervention, these families are still, in some cases, in that period of shell shock, maybe just recently getting a diagnosis, maybe not fully understanding what the diagnosis means, and then having to face a whole new system with all these new staff. So this is a huge issue in terms of shifting trust to school staff, especially because the great majority of early intervention support happens within the home environment where parents feel more comfortable, where they feel like, okay, this is our context, this is where we live. So, of course, it's not always possible to have a seamless transition, but let me just share some ideas with you. And I'm going to tell a story that involved a transition that I was involved with, and this is one of the many times I learned from a school administrator about really engaging families in a way that develops trust. And this is a special ed administrator in the Northeast who always made the commitment, a personal commitment, to try to touch base with parents whose kids are in early intervention, and when she gets information that these children will be transitioning into her district, she reaches out personally. Sometimes with a staff member, and on one occasion I actually went with her to the home after she contacted the parents, and this was not a formal transition meeting. That's often required to do all the paperwork and so forth, but she called up and spoke to the mom and basically said, you know, your child will be coming into our district and I'd like to meet you and I'd like to meet your child. Is that okay? And I'd be happy to come out to your home. And so she asked me to go with her, and I went to this home with her, and they happened to have two kids, twin girls, both with an autism diagnosis. And we went into this home, and this was a lower SES family with limited space, and you could imagine with the two kids, and there was some degree of clutter in the home, but we just went there and we sat down on the floor and played with the kids a little bit, and the mom made us some coffee, and we just hung out with them for about 45 minutes or an hour, very open conversation. What questions do you have? The kids were going to be transitioning in, I believe it was 4 to 6 months later. And what this special ed administrator said to me was that when she shares this strategy with other administrators, they often look at her cockeyed and say, how do you have the time for that? My God, we're just so busy. And her response was, in the end, over the years, she discovered it actually was a time saver, that putting the extra effort into developing trust with families, going the extra mile, in the end results in parents who believe you, who trust you. And this particular administrator said to me, I know that this strategy precludes many nervous calls that would have happened if I hadn't established that personal contact. So a few years later, you have parents who put more trust in your decisions, put more trust in what you're suggesting. So I know that's not always possible, especially in huge school districts, but certainly reaching out on an interpersonal level, whether it's an administrator, whether it's staff, I think that's a very, very important piece from early intervention into the school year. Certainly transition meetings. Again, that basic theme in what we've just discussed, reducing uncertainty so that parents can know what to expect, putting it in writing, giving this written information to them ahead of time, and then set up a meeting where they could ask either a group of parents or an individual parent ask questions about those guidelines, and at the same time informing the parent of how they can expect things to unfold. There are some more specific suggestions out of early intervention. For example, some districts I consult to will always send a staff member, a preschool staff member, out to observe the child in a play group or observe the child at home. And this is more to get some information about the child and to ask questions as opposed to primarily developing that trust with parents. Of course, sometimes it can happen in the same visit. And certainly from the very beginning, asking parents coming out of early intervention, well, what has been most useful to you? What's the information that has been provided to you that you say, yeah, that really was so helpful to me? And then that gives us a sense of what parents are looking for. And then sometimes in a very outward verbal sense, saying, well, here's how we will try to put into place in your child's school program what you just said to me was helpful. So in other words, what you're saying is we're not going to kind of cut off everything that was helpful to you in early intervention and everything you learn, that we are going to provide continuity of programming. And I think when parents feel like what they're getting in one setting, whether it's early interventions versus elementary, elementary versus middle school versus high school, when parents feel that it is just a totally different system with a totally different cast of characters, that creates so much more anxiety for them. If we could communicate to them this sense of continuity of programming, we're going to build upon the successes that your child has had. We're going to follow up on the concerns that still remain significant concerns. I think that is just so calming for parents, knowing that, okay, we're not starting from scratch all over again.
Well, Barry, one of the things, of the many things that we love about hearing from you on these programs is the way you tell these stories, and the stories just really relate to us and our experiences. It's not just theory. This is like real stuff going out in the world with real people, real families, real kids. We love that, and telling stories is such a great way to get information across. So thanks for that. And I want to switch over to some other questions coming in about collaboration, and I'm going to weave in a question that just came in just a few minutes ago to one that we got a little bit earlier. But the question is, how are the issues of family engagement different for children with special needs compared to those families of children who are developing more typically? Would you use different strategies? And then a related question just came in, Barry, which was about whether these strategies that you're talking about would apply to students that are going to a private school
as a public school. So they're really kind of asking about groups of students. Do these approaches work across groups, or is it specific to special ed?
I do believe they work across groups, and certainly when we're talking about successful family engagement, some of the themes I discussed go for parents of typically developing kids as well as parents of kids with special needs. But then we have to understand the special layer of challenges that we face when children have special needs. So, for example, this notion of uncertainty, that for typically developing kids, parents will expect that their child will progress through school, that they will be in the mainstream curriculum, that they will be in a regular classroom, if you will, full-time with typically developing peers. A lot of those issues are in question with kids with special needs. Now, that of course, depends upon the philosophy of the school district. So a school district that has partial inclusion or more self-contained classrooms, those are issues that are uncertain to parents. Will my child be with friends who are typically developing? Will my child be with kids that my son or daughter sees in the neighborhood? Or is it going to be with other kids who have special needs? So in many cases, the special supports that have to be in place place a special layer of obligation on our part when a child has special needs. So, for example, for a typically developing child, a teacher who's cognizant of the importance of letting kids know what's going to happen during the day just might write it down on the blackboard and speak to the class. But for a child with significant developmental disabilities and communication disabilities, that child might need to have a visual schedule that's designed specifically for him or her. So when we talk about these special supports, obviously, it begs the question of how do we educate parents about those supports? How do we support parents in implementing those supports outside of the school environment as well? So to answer the question, once again, I think that there are those themes of really listening to parents, of reducing uncertainty, of helping parents to be able to express their concerns that are common across all children. But because of the special considerations and needs of special needs kids, we have this whole other layer that actually dictates that we engage with families in slightly different ways, that we give them more time, that maybe we're going to be more concerned about the home environment because of the impact of a child with special needs in terms of supports or lack of supports across different environments. So it's not, the answer is yes and no. We would use different strategies, but in general, the themes of supporting a parent's knowledge of what's coming up, what the expectations are, what are the school expectations for how a child engages about their behavior, some of those things might be similar.
Well, we've had lots of questions, Barry, similar to the next question I'm going to ask you, but if you kind of would lump them all together into a category, we're really talking about how do we get families and parents motivated? How do we encourage them to get more involved? How do we motivate them? How do we, get them to follow through with things and all that? So we've had a bunch of questions come in on that topic. So I'll just kind of roll those all up into a summary question. What is the best way, Barry, to encourage and motivate parents to get involved and to carry over what it takes to help the child and to take what's going on in school and take it into the home?
That's a great question, and again, something that I run into all the time in my consulting. So let's start from the perspective of the educator, the special educator, the special service provider, SLPs, OTs, PTs. And from our perspective, what we're thinking is, I'm a well-trained professional, and I have these great suggestions and these great ideas that I know will help your child outside of school. So here they are. Please do them, okay? And I think it's always helpful, as we discussed, to take the perspective of the parent. So the perspective of the parent might be, oh yeah, well, I hear what you're saying, and I know that's important to you, but on our list of priorities, it may not be that important to us. Or, I hear what you're saying, and I understand some of it, but I really don't understand everything you're saying. Or, I hear what you're saying, I think it will be helpful, and I understand what you're saying about using, for example, this visual schedule, but I really don't know how to use it. Or, that's just not something that's a priority for us right now because my dad's in the hospital and I have to run and see him every night, and I know you say we should get going on this immediately, but I'm sorry, it just can't happen right now. So I think the point number one is to understand why it is that sometimes parents are not able to follow through, or they seem as if they're choosing not to follow through. And the flip side of that is how can we encourage them and motivate them. So point number one, and this is something that we should be doing anyway, is to make sure that we're addressing parental priorities. And one of my personal strategies always is to ask parents, when I make a suggestion or I'm working with a staff member who's making a suggestion, is this something that's important to you? Is this something that you value? And if the parent says yes, then we need to follow up with another suggestion. Do you need any kind of information or help in terms of following through on what we're suggesting? And sometimes parents will say yes, and sometimes parents will say no. They say, I got it. And then the third thing is this something that you feel you could start at this point in time or relatively soon, or is this something that maybe is on your punch list for something to do down the line? So I think we really have to focus on why is it that in some cases when we make a suggestion to the parent and we ask 2 weeks later, well, how's that going? And the parent says, well, I never really gotten to that yet. We need to really consider why and sometimes ask them why. And this is why it's important. So often when we make what we think are positive suggestions can actually cause a great deal of guilt for parents, especially when they feel, I know I should be doing this, and they're not. So if they kind of embrace that the suggestion would be helpful and they just can't fit it into their lives, or they don't know how to implement that support, or they don't have the time or whatever, there's many parents will feel like, wow, I'm really screwing up as a parent here. So we have to acknowledge the stresses on their life, the stresses on the family, and find the best way to reach that common ground of not only what is helpful, but what is doable, and in some cases, what is doable only if we as educators and therapists provide the right support. The worst case scenario is to have that judgmental attitude, as I discussed earlier, and say, I just can't believe that parent, I made up this beautiful visual schedule for the child, or, I provided this great organizational support to help the mom with the child's homework, and she's just not using it. In some cases, again, we haven't asked that why question. Well, why isn't she using it? Maybe it's not a priority right now. So that's the essence, I believe, of encouraging and motivating parents. We have to really try to understand where our suggestions fall in the line of priorities in the life of the family and for that parent. Just some other quick suggestions. If a parent does respond positively to something we're suggesting and we're feeling that, well, maybe they don't know how to implement it, can we, even if you're a school staff member, go into the home one time and demonstrate how we use that communication board or the iPad or the visual support or whatever it is? Is that possible? If that's not possible, can the parent come into school and observe at a designated time the way supports are being used, or the way the staff simplifies language for the child, or the way the staff uses transitional supports to help a child go from one area, one activity to another, or from the classroom to the cafeteria? Now, of course, I know many people out there are thinking, oh yeah, I know some of my kids, when they see their parent in school, forget it, the day's shot. So obviously we wouldn't do it under those circumstances. But we want to help parents really see and understand how suggestions can be implemented and how supports can be implemented, and not just assume that just because we tell them verbally or even hand them instruction sheet that they're able to follow through.
Well, it's tough. I mean, as a parent, Barry, myself, and you're a parent, you know the stresses and strains on our schedules and trying to juggle priorities is crazy for everybody these days, and it seems like it continues to get crazier with technology. So all of us are kind of in that same boat, and you point out some really great ideas to motivate people and get us to work together better. Another change and trend, as we all know, and we had many questions, Barry, coming in throughout this webinar today about this particular topic, and it's cultural diversity. You know, our classrooms continue to get more and more diverse, lots of different languages being spoken, lots of cultural backgrounds, lots of different kinds of socioeconomic backgrounds, lots of different kind of family structures. And it seems like particularly when there's a language barrier, i.e. the family doesn't speak English, it presents some serious challenges for family collaboration. So how do we best manage families of many cultural and linguistic backgrounds, Barry?
Yeah, I think my first suggestion, of course, which is not the solution to all these very complex issues, is to educate ourselves about the culture where families come from, what they value, what they don't value, and just how we can gain trust with them. So let me just share a quick story. When I was teaching in a graduate program in communication disorders, some of my students were going out to the homes of recently immigrated Vietnamese families in the Boston area. And they had a designated amount of time that they could visit each family, and it was part of early intervention training. And what they found was that there were issues around developing trusting relationships while visiting some of the families. And we did bring in a cultural interpreter to speak to the students after they had been doing some of these practices with home visits for a while. And what she brought up was that some of the families expressed concerns to her that the students would come in and they would want to begin doing their therapy and their work with the kids right away, even though the mother had prepared some wonderful snacks for them. And they didn't make the time to sit down, chat with the parents, and have snacks with them. Well, it ends up in Vietnamese culture. It's considered, and I may be a little bit off on this in the language I'm using, but it's considered to be off-putting and maybe even a little bit of an insult. If you enter somebody's home and they want to sit down and offer you, some wonderful snacks to eat, and you say, no, I'd rather not, thank you. So being aware of the culture and the cultural values in the long term, is very, very important. As part of this, I mentioned cultural interpreter, and certainly that has to do with linguistic interpreter. Can we, when we connect with a family, especially if there are significant linguistic differences and in some cases cultural differences, are there people who could serve as language interpreters or cultural interpreters? And that's very, very important. And you might say, who might that be? Well, in my experience, a few years ago, we had a parent, a single mom, recently immigrated from Puerto Rico, and it ends up that her mother was fluent in English. Her mother had lived here already for a number of years, and she was coming up to live with her mom and bringing her absolutely adorable little daughter, but the mom had very limited English proficiency. So her grandmother came to many of the progress report meetings and the more formal PPTs and IEP meetings, and not only did that serve to develop great trust with the mother, but it also helped the grandmother feel very, very engaged and very, very informed. And this wonderful mom, I'll never forget, after every meeting, and in most cases it was literally sentence-by-sentence interpretation by the grandmother, she was just so grateful to the staff, and she would hug everybody and basically said, you are angels, the way you interact with me and that you interact with my child. And that just could not have happened if there wasn't a family member. It doesn't have to be a family member. In many cases, church communities are more than willing to provide people to be both cultural interpreters and linguistic interpreters. But I think we have to really enter these situations understanding that even more so than, let's say, an English-speaking family that lives in the United States that's raising a child with a disability, there's this extra layer of stress and complexity when families come from different cultures or are not English proficient. And we need to, once again, find the supports that we could put into place for that. Now, another issue related to this, which I believe I discussed earlier, is the cultural differences in how parents view professionals. So earlier in the discussion, we spoke about how in some cultures, professionals are put up on such a pedestal, in a sense, that parents feel that there's nothing that they can do to help their child, that it's really up to you to fix my child. And then I believe we have to engage in more parent education, in helping parents from different cultures. It's not always from different cultures. It could be, a family that's lived in this culture for a while, but helping them understand that they play such a central role and that we have a partnership here. You're not going to be on this journey alone. We're going to be on this journey with you. But it needs to be a partnership. And for some families, we can just cite, for example, in the autism literature, when people have looked at the factors that relate to better outcomes for kids with autism, one of the greatest factors is family involvement. Again, not saying that in such a way that it's all on your shoulders, because that could cause a lot of stress and guilt, but that we want you to be engaged. We are better as professionals when we have you engaged. And we will listen to you and we'll respect what you have to say. And I think with some families we could say it doesn't mean we're always going to agree with what you say. So let me give you an example of that. Many parents of non-speaking kids feel that if we use non-speech systems, augmentative alternative systems, speech-generating devices, some parents will say, I don't want that because my child will never need to learn to speak. And if it's easy for him to point to pictures, or if it's easy for her to use her iPad to communicate, then she'll just never learn to speak. Well, it just so happens that the research tells us the opposite, that children are more likely to go on to acquire speech when they develop the social communication skills that underlies speech development, the ability to take turns, the ability to express different intentions, for example. So that would be an example where a parent's sense, or if you will, kind of common sense is not accurate. And it is commonsensical that if a child has other ways to communicate, why should they learn to speak? Okay? Something related to this is, and I know I'm a little bit off the topic of cultural and linguistic diversity, but it kind of relates to this in this sense, and that is some parents are told by other parents, don't let your child, for example, use that picture system. For my child, we never let him to use any speaking now. And so sometimes the advice, which could be very well-meaning, from another parent who has a child with special needs, still may not be very accurate for that particular parent. So we need to provide information. We need to be a resource. We need to respect what parents bring to us, but at the same time, be factual and give good, clear information based upon our experience. And then in some cases, it's a compromise. In some cases, we have to join with families and say, certainly we could try that, but we're also going to do this and this as well. And I think when parents feel engaged and when they feel that they're being heard, they're more likely to be able to say, I came into this meeting thinking that I needed to have it this way, but I respect what you're saying, so let's go along with that. So let me tie it back to the issues of cultural and linguistic diversity. I think that if we feel, especially for those of you who are listening, who are kind of culturally mainstream, middle-class, English-speaking Americans, and if we feel that we are ignorant in some cases of issues related to families from different cultures, then I think it's important for us to try to be educated. In some cases that happens at the school level. In some cases it doesn't happen much at all and people fly by the seat of their pants. Of course, it happens at a school level if there's a particular group that's culturally different. That's a larger number of families. But too often when there are just isolated families or just a few, I just see too many educators and therapists flying by the seat of their pants, and then I think we need to gather more information about that.
No doubt. Well, Barry, you mentioned compromise, something probably none of us like to do, but it's a fact of life, isn't it? So we got a lot of questions about compromising and negotiating and trying to find a balance with requests and kind of things that may not sound real friendly coming in from parents. And so this whole matter of negotiating services and the intensity of services and the goals and the therapy approaches and all this thing has been a focal point for a number of questions that we have received from the audience today. So let me start with this one, Barry. How can we help parents to understand that more services is not necessarily better services?
Oh yes, this is a toughie, especially when parents are hearing, again, sometimes from other parents or sometimes from outside professionals, you need to get more hours of therapy for your child. You know, what you're getting is not enough hours. Well, it just so happens that our philosophy in working with many kids with autism, many kids with related disabilities, communication disabilities, developmental disabilities, is that coordination of services, if you will, is a better marker of intensity than services than simply is the number of hours. So let me say that again. Coordination of services is a more clear marker of intensity of service rather than the numbers of hours, especially the numbers of hours of pull-out therapy. Now, why is that the case? I mean, isn't it logical that if a parent feels that if their child gets 5 hours of speech and language therapy a week, you know, that's better than maybe getting 3 half-hour sessions, but having the SLP consult with staff and having all the staff trained in strategies that they could use to support a child's communication development? Well, think of it the other way. If more time and more effort is put into coordinating, where you have a very talented classroom teacher who makes communication opportunities throughout the day, who knows how to use non-speech communication systems and speech-generating devices for kids who need that, where the staff also puts the time into providing informational and training sessions to parents, then that child is getting that support throughout the day across partners and across settings. In contrast to a child who may be getting individual pull-out speech and language therapy, where by the nature of the caseload of the SLP, she or he is just not available to monitor programs, to do in-classroom co-teaching, to consulting. So, and again, being a speech-language pathologist, I'm giving a lot of examples around social communication and language, but this also goes for OTs, PTs, psych services, so many other kinds of services. So that's something that I believe falls into the category of educational support to parents and to families. And the educational support being that if we can be as consistent as possible across all the child's partners, across all the child's settings, that is providing a more intensive learning experience. To use a word that everybody knows, your child is much more likely to generalize what he or she is learning because those opportunities and those supports are in place across all settings. I have found that it's typically parents of younger kids who hear, again, from a variety of sources, from some professionals, from something they've read, from other parents. They hear that, you know, you need to really build up those hours because hours of therapy equals quality of program. And I will tell you, in my 40 years of experience working in all kinds of settings and in hundreds of school districts, by far the best programs I have seen is when there is that careful coordination and parents are educated about the importance of that careful coordination rather than just counting hours like chips, if you will. Now, you still could count hours, but you could count hours in terms of educational sessions for all of the staff, in terms of monitoring by specialists in classrooms, maybe not providing direct services, in terms of actually consulting to educators who are likely to see the child much more often. And by the way, let me not leave out paraprofessionals and aides as well. I consult with some programs where paraprofessionals get wonderful support from teachers and therapists, and they are very skilled throughout the whole day in providing that support to a child that they're working with. And I consult to other programs where the SLP, the OT, comes in, pulls the child out, the para takes a break and goes off and gets a snack, and there's not that coordination at all. It's not a focus of what's going on.
Wow. Well, Barry, let's take it a step further, because that question related to parents who might think more services is better. What about the situation where you've got a parent that's kind of difficult to deal with, and in your view, as a professional in special education, this child of this parent, no longer needs the services that the parent's demanding? Then what do you do? When those situations come up, I often think that the issue that is very stressful to the parent, and stress makes a parent more quote-unquote difficult, is when they feel that their child is just being cut off from something that's been helpful. So when it is said to a parent that, well, your child no longer needs these services, why are you demanding these services? I think what works the best is more of a step-down approach. And I alluded to that in my previous answer, that rather than just cutting off services, that maybe the SLP or the OT will continue to consult or continue to monitor the child over maybe a few months after the direct services were terminated. And this can be written into the IEP in that way. And I find that many parents will say, okay, well, you're just not, dropping my child from everything that's been helpful to him or her, that you are continuing to monitor, and sometimes with the caveat that if we see, well, wait a second, since we've stopped services, maybe your child is not progressing as well, so let's build them back in again. Because to tell you the truth, sometimes we just don't know. Children are ever-developing beings, and sometimes we feel pretty certain that your child doesn't need services at this point in time, but I've seen kids where they initially did well when supports were taken away, and it could be anything from direct services to visual supports to a one-to-one aid, and lo and behold, the parent was right, but this child is not doing as well. So I think if we, number one, see it as a step-down process as opposed to we're cutting you off from all the services that have been helpful, and number two, if we communicate to parents that, this is an indication of progress. We really feel your child is doing so well. And then maybe, for example, having a one-to-one aid, is holding the child back a little bit. We'd like to shift to maybe a part-time aide, where it's a classroom aide who monitors a couple of kids. But we're also going to be monitoring your child's progress. And we will be honest with you. If we feel like this has been detrimental to your child's progress, then maybe we'll step in and provide a level of support that we haven't provided before. I think that last statement, even though I know some of you out there are thinking, oh boy, that puts us between a rock and a hard place, I think it helps parents accept that step-down process rather than, okay, your child doesn't get speech and language services at all anymore. Because too many parents think of their child as exceptionally vulnerable, and what they may be feeling is, you're taking my vulnerable child and you're just kind of throwing him overboard, sink or swim. And I am a parent who's not going to allow that to happen. Boy, that's a scary visual, isn't it? And I know all the parents feel that way. I've had some challenges with my own children to deal with, so I can really relate to that as a parent, Barry. I'm looking at the clock, and I'm looking at the list of questions flowing in. It's unbelievable. We could go on for days, Barry, so I know we don't have days of time with you, which I know many people would like, and I would encourage everybody to contact you and get you out to their district for a workshop. Oh my gosh, what an incredible opportunity. But right now we're going to have one more question that just came in, Barry. I think this is a good one. It's probably a great one to end on because it's a great segue from the topic we were just discussing, and that is, how can professionals support the parent who is really not ready to hear the diagnosis for their child, the parent who's kind of in that denial stage?
Okay. Well, let's start, with the term denial. Rather than viewing denial as something negative, let's understand how denial is viewed now from a family or parent perspective. And that is, denial is, if you will, a stage or a step where parents are gathering information. In other words, I know you're saying autism, but emotionally I'm not ready or willing to embrace what you're saying. So I need to gather some more information around that. And I think one of the strategies that I use all the time around early diagnosis is developing a consensus with parents. I think very often parents who are in that stage of I'm not ready to hear that, but I'm gathering information, will really put up their shield when we lead with diagnosis. When we say, I think your child has autism, I think your child has ADHD. Some parents right away will say, well, but a lot of kids are active, or a lot of kids are shy. But when we start talking about, here's what both myself as a professional and here's what our team sees, do you see this as well? That your child has difficulty, let's take autism, your child has difficulty playing with imagination, or your child often prefers to, seems to prefer to be more on his own than around other children. Or your child does not point out things to you that he sees that are interesting, that joint attention notion, or your child does not use a point to show things to you, some of the red flags for autism. Some of these very observable things are things that parents could say, you're right, I don't see those things. And so what we're doing is sometimes we're demystifying the labels that we use, and rather than leading with diagnosis, we're saying, here are a cluster of features that we observe in your child's behavior. Do you see that? When a parent says that, oh yeah, I see that too, then we could say, well, these are the types of things that are used to describe a child with whatever it might be, a learning disability, ADHD, autism. And then what you've done is you demystified the label because the parent already has agreed that they see that. You may get a response from some parents, something along the lines of, well, wait a second, he does show some interest in some kids. He's not totally on his own and isolated all the time. Or I thought kids with autism sit in the corner and just bang their heads against walls. And so what we're doing is we're beginning on the path of education, of giving parents information and letting them know that their observations are very, very important. Now, having said that, in terms of reaching a consensus around diagnosis, we do have to understand that there is something, for lack of a better term, that's called pathological denial. And that is when the parent has gotten information from a variety of sources, time has passed, and the parent refuses to have their child receive any kind of special supports or services. So it's pathological in the sense that the child is restricted from getting the help they need, which everybody who has seen the child might think of this, okay, we've reached the point of the child literally in a neglectful situation, okay, where what's happening is because the child's needs are not being met, this is an issue of neglect here. I would say that's extremely rare in my experience, but we still run into those situations where in every way the parents have been supported, they've been given the information, maybe the child has been seen by 2 or 3 independent professionals as well as the school team, and nothing's happening in terms of the parents willing to sign an IEP and going along with, that whole process of getting the right supports in place for the child.
Well, Barry, we talked about denial. I know the whole audience, and including me as the moderator, is in denial that our time is up. Oh, my goodness. This just flew by. So this has been amazing, and we have a flood of questions. I want to assure everybody we will address those questions in a blog afterwards. So don't lose heart if your question did not get answered. And I want to, at this point, just thank every one of you who's listening out there who attended this webinar for your interest and your questions. And also a very, very special thank you to Dr. Barry Prizant, an amazing presenter, for sharing his incredible wealth of knowledge and his stories with us today. Just a quick update on Barry for you before we leave. I would like to say that we've got an update from Simon & Schuster, and his book, which I alluded to in the introduction, will be available in August. So get ready for that, folks. It's going to be an amazing book. And I want to also thank you from all of your friends at Presence Learning, where everyone is committed to providing highly personal online therapy from the best therapists to ease your burdens and extend your resources. Every school district across this country can benefit from this. And I just want to invite you to join us for our next webinar, the final in this great series that Barry referred to, Tuesday, December 2nd. We're going to be welcoming Dr. Alan Coulter, an expert on results-driven accountability. In fact, he helped write the federal policy on this. So he's going to be talking about this major shift from focusing on compliance to actually improving educational results for students with special needs. You need to find out what RDA means for your district and what you need to know. So please join us on December 2nd. And you know, your feedback on these webinar programs is critical, particularly for me as the executive producer. I need to know what you'd like to see us do better, what topics to cover, how we did today. So please, please take just a minute when we wrap up. You'll be directed to a feedback survey right away for today's webinar. And if you just take a moment to fill it out and let us know what you thought about our program today, we would be so appreciative. And be sure to watch your email, too, for a certificate of attendance and links to the recording and the slides for the program from today, and share them with your colleagues who weren't here for this incredible program. And we'll also be posting a link to the recording on the Presence Learning website. Just look for the SPED Ahead archives, along with 3 years' worth of incredible programming. You'll find today's. And you can replay the recordings from this webinar today and all of our SPED Ahead webinars on the Presence Learning site. And for CEU questions, just give us an email, ceu@presencelearning.com. And if you'd like to have a demo of the Presence Learning services, just email schools@presencelearning.com. Love to hear from you and love to show you what we can do to help you. Thanks again, and have a great day.